This is not a great translation of Exodus 20, verse 13. The Hebrew there is lo tirtzach, and ratzach is a verbal root that means to murder, or in some cases, particularly associated with sanctuary cities, unintentional homicide. In all cases, however, it refers to the killing of someone who has full legal and moral personhood. So the question then becomes, does the Bible attribute full legal and moral personhood to a fetus? If it does not, then this verse simply does not apply to abortion. And there is no place in the Bible where full legal and moral personhood is ever attributed to a fetus. The only direct reference to the potential personhood of a fetus is found in Exodus 21, verses 22 and 23. This is part of the covenant code. These passages are addressing what is to be done should two men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And there are two outcomes that are addressed. The first is that the injury causes a miscarriage, and the penalty that is to be assessed is a fine imposed by the husband, which treats the miscarried fetus more like property than like a person, and specifically like the property of the husband. The other outcome that is addressed is if the injury results in the death of the pregnant woman, and the penalty there is life for life, the death penalty. So what that indicates is that a fetus is not considered the equivalent of a full legal and moral person, but something less than, something closer to property and further away from a full legal and moral person. Now, there are some people who are going to object to this reading and say, no, it's referring to one outcome where there is premature birth but no further injury to the baby, and then the other outcome is miscarriage. And there is no support for this. This is a misreading of this passage, and that's very clear. This part of the covenant code is borrowing and adapting laws directly from the laws of Hammurabi, and a great book on that is David Wright's book, Inventing God's Law. And so this is pulling from Hammurabi's law, I think laws 209 and 210. If it's not those specific ones, it's in the neighborhood, which refer to two outcomes of injury to a pregnant woman, either causing a miscarriage, causing the death of the pregnant woman. And the penalties that are imposed in Hammurabi's laws are different, but we find these same two outcomes addressed in a number of laws from ancient Southwest Asia. And it is always the same: what to do should an injury cause a miscarriage or cause the death of the woman.
So there you have Dan McClellan's reading of Exodus 21 and his attempt to say that it denies the full personhood of unborn children. It's important to remember what the text says exactly, because what we'll find is that Dan's reading is actually very contrary to the plain meaning of the text. So let's put the text in front of us here. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, there are a number of serious problems with Dan's reading of Exodus chapter 21. The first is that he rightly sees that there are two different scenarios that Exodus 21 verses 22 to 25 have in view, but he wrongly says the first one has to do with miscarriage. The first scenario, so to speak, the first outcome is given in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, and I'll put the text back on the screen, and just see if you can find where the reference to miscarriage would be in this verse. It very clearly is not there. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, then there is a fine. Where in this text is there anything with regard to miscarriage? It simply is not there. And this leads into the second very significant error that Dan makes with regard to the interpretation of the text, which is that he supposes that the first outcome is related to the miscarriage of the child. The second one is related to harm done to the mother. And so he is setting up this idea where the two different outcomes are related to two different kinds of people receiving this action or damage. And yet very clearly in the text, if you just read it, what you find is that the contrast is not between who has harm done to them, but whether there is harm done at all. That is to say, the contrast is damage, not people, not person, not child on the one hand, mother on the other, but whether or not there is harm. So you think of again, just where is the contrast? What are the two things that are being said? In verse 22 of Exodus 21, we have the men fighting. They hit the pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm. The very important phrase, but there is no harm. Then there is the fine that is imposed. Then we have verse 23. There is the other scenario where we see, but if there is harm, if there is harm. So here we have the contrast, the only contrast that we find in verses 22 and 23. If there is no harm versus if there is harm. The contrast is not between two different kinds of people. There is nothing in the text that would even suggest that that would be the case. Furthermore, then, if we were to ask the question, well, who is in view with regard to this harm? Is it the child in both cases, or is it the mother in both cases? It certainly cannot be Dan's reading of the child first and then the mother. But who is in view? Well, the answer is very clearly from the text, the child is in view. Just again, think of verse 22. The two men are fighting. They hit the pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm. So the near referent for harm, the basic understanding of interpretation, the basic rules of interpretation would say that the near referent of harm is the children who come out. The children come out, but there is no harm. That is to say, there is no harm to the children. And if this is the case, then the contrast that comes in verse 23, if there is harm, must also refer to the children. There is no qualification given. There is no suggestion or hint of a change of referent, and therefore we're to understand that this is also referring to the children. But we don't even need to guess about this because there is actually an ancient interpretation that corroborates this reading. This is the plain reading of the text. It's very clearly what the original is saying, what the English is saying, what the Hebrew is saying. But we could say even more, the ancient interpretation of the Septuagint also confirms this reading, because when the word harm is translated into the Septuagint, into Greek, it is translated using a perfect passive participle. And the significant thing about participles is that a participle must agree with the noun that it modifies. And significantly, this contrast, if there is no harm, if there is harm, is given by the perfect passive participle exekonis menon. And the significant thing is that exekonis menon is a neuter participle, which means it cannot grammatically refer to the woman. It cannot grammatically refer to the mother. If you were to ask, what is the referent? The answer very clearly is to paidion, that is to say, the word child, which is grammatically neuter in Greek and is very close, right next to the participle itself. Now, significantly, when the text says in verse 22 that there is no harm, it is me exekonis menon, so there's a denial of exekonis menon. And then in 23, where there is the presence of this thing, it says exekonis menon, which is also a neuter participle, and therefore is also explicitly referring to the child. And therefore the Septuagint, very ancient understanding of this verse, agrees with the very clear understanding that we have from the Hebrew and in the English, that both situations are referring to the child. And the question is not whether or not the harm is done to the woman versus the child, but whether or not there is harm at all that is done to the child. Now, Dan also defends his reading by appealing to ancient Near Eastern parallels. He quotes the laws of Hammurabi and other ancient Near Eastern texts, and he says, look, this is always what we see in the ancient Near East. Now, there are a number of problems with this. The very first one is that critical and unbelieving scholars will very often simply go to the ancient Near Eastern parallels, and they will always overplay their hand with regard to the nature of these parallels. They actually must do this methodologically. It's actually a methodologically binding thing for them. And the reason is because they deny God, they deny special revelation, and then inherently then they think the ancient Near East must be just like Israel, and Israel must be just like the ancient Near East. The laws must be the same. And yet, this is the exact opposite of the Bible's self-understanding. You think of even with regard to its own laws. You think of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, where we read this: "See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." Now, the reason this is significant is because, at the very least, the self-perception of Deuteronomy is to see its laws as quite distinct and different from the rest of the ancient Near East, such that they will see the laws and say, look, this is a people that's wise and understanding, different than us, is the implication. Now, you could say perhaps the claim was made, but it's not true. But in either case, it would be quite strange for this sort of claim to be made, and then for the laws of the Israelites to be exactly like the ancient Near East in every way. It's quite a strange thing, and yet it is a thing that is demanded of us by the critical scholars. Furthermore, a distant ancient Near Eastern parallel does not overturn the plain reading of the text. If it is the case that the laws of Hammurabi are dealing with what happens to the child and then what happens to the mother, things like that, that is fine. It is obviously not what is going on in Exodus chapter 1, 22 to 25. And a proposed ancient Near Eastern parallel cannot be made to override the clear meaning of the text. Now, this is clearly what the grammar teaches. It is the meaning of the text, and it's significant for a number of reasons. First and most obviously, this is showing that the Bible does accord full personhood to unborn children. It is without question the case. The Bible accords full personhood to unborn children. They are not, as Dan quite perversely reads the text, merely property in the eyes of the Bible. It is simply not what the Bible is teaching, contrary to what he might say. The Bible is not a reflection of modern American leftist social values. It simply is not the case. But there is even a second thing that we can say about the significance of this, because this phrase, this way of describing justice, a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on, this becomes a standard way that the Bible describes the principles of justice. The principles of justice are to be given to everyone according to what he deserves. And the way in which this is done in terms of bodily harm is to say eye for eye, life for life, tooth for tooth, and all the rest. And this is said multiple times in the scriptures. The significant thing here is that Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25, refer to the very first time when this phrase is used, the very first time that this principle is communicated in this way, life for life, eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. And significantly, the very first time the Bible expounds this principle of justice, it is in the context of giving full personhood and rights to unborn children. And therefore, we can say with confidence that the Bible teaches that the killing of an unborn child in abortion is actually a violation of the sixth commandment. That is clearly what the Bible teaches. Now, when you hear me say that, there are two things that you could do. And very often this becomes a very emotional topic, and I am aware of that. You could double down and argue against what the Bible teaches and try to say that the Bible supports the views of modern leftist social morality. You could try to do that. You're arguing against the clear reading of the text, the testimony of God. You're also arguing against your own conscience, which testifies that this is in fact true, what I am saying, that it is wrong to take the life of an unborn child. So this is one option, one thing you could do. And what I'm saying is that will not work. It will not help you. The other thing that you can do is recognize that this is a sin, and yet recognize further that if you turn to the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be forgiven and saved from even this sin. Those are the only two options that you have. And my exhortation to you is to choose the latter, to recognize that this is a sin. And if you are involved in this sin in any way, the answer is not to try to hide from it. The answer is to confront it, confess it, call out to God for mercy, and then be thankful that he is a God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And he forgives all of those who come to him and call upon the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.